Get your butts and coconuts ready because Unholy DK is the video today. That rhyme, that's pretty cool. Ooh, we're going to take a look at the best performing melee spec in the first week of Mythic Nyalotha, at least as of recording this video, so you can get your darkness, virulent, oozing pustules. Yeah. You'll get your talents, essences, gear rotation, and a lot more for Unholy DK in 8.3 in our updated guide for the spec. Ooh. As always, the spec will focus on the basics and fundamentals to get you started and pick up the class and smash some dungeons and raids. To accomplish this, we asked bicep, pumps, and toe. Is that how you say it? It's actually kind of cool. From the Accurus Discord community, one of the best Unholy DKs in the world, so thank you guys so much for the feedback. Starting off on the first row, All Will Serve will be your primary single target talent choice. It will work on most raid bosses, and it's an easy set and forget option where you raise dead spell will summon an additional skeleton archer. Clawing Shadows works well with a lot of mastery, and if you can take advantage of the added utility. It's a bit niche and conditioned to be effective, but it's still a valid option to consider. The alternative for Mythic Plus and some AoE raid fights is Infected Claws. In dungeons, this will be vastly superior since you want to spread wounds to as many targets as possible, which Infected Claws will help you with. In raids though, it remains to be seen. The theory is that it could start to get better and better as the season progresses, but it comes down to how you use it, how it sims, and so on. On the second row, take Ebon Fever for raids and general single target. This talent will make your Virulent Plague deal more damage in half the time, and it's usually the best single target option on the row. In Mythic dungeons and certain raid bosses like Hive Mind and Carapace, take Bursting Swords instead. Specifically in heavy AoE scenarios, Bursting Swords adds to the infamous quadratic scaling in damage that the spec is popular for. When you have a bunch of wounds out on a few targets and you pop a Death and Decay and start Scorch Striking, all targets that burst apply this effect to all other targets, meaning through the power of math, your DPS meter will explode. On the third row, you have a utility row. In raids, it will only come into play for boss ads and ones that can be CC'd. Asphyxiate will be your default choice, providing you with a long-range stun that can help you interrupt things, like fellow mind-controlled raiders, so you can kill them quick and make them regret their actions. But also, actual trash that has an impact, and the thing from beyond if you are running with enough corruption where this can spawn. Same argument applies in dungeons as well, with an exception. Grip of the Dead can be a big addition if you need to slow the pack to let your tank kite it. This is very niche and usually discussed, so it's good for you to know you have this option. The fourth tier brings Soul Reaper and Soul Reaper only. Take Soul Reaper. What? There are other talents? Nah, there's only Soul Reaper. One of the main uses of this, aside from the obvious, is in M+. You'll find yourself prepping for a big Death and Decay window and out of runes. Having this on demand gives you more control over the fight, and this can apply to other situations outside Mythic Plus as well. Pestilent Pustules is a niche option that works if you play in a very well organized group that can pull entire rooms of packs for you, and almost never happens in pugs and even regular +15s groups. It's good to know it's there, but I recommend you stick with Soul Reaper anyway. The fifth tier is a survivability orientated row. That being said, in raid you kinda want Wraith Walk almost always, which is mobility. There's a lot of movement going on there, and it's no surprise Unholy is as fast as a cat on a lazy morning. Not much else to debate about this. The rest of the row is very situational and it depends on what you need, all options being very good for both raids and dungeons. Spell Eater makes your AMS absorb a crap ton of magic damage if you ever feel you need it for a fight. Death Pact is a solid HP heal that can save your butt. Usually works in unpredictable situations or when your healer cannot heal you for some reasons, like the horrific visions. Reaching the 6th row, you should take Epidemic always. Similar to Frost, outside of a talent, you don't really have a way to convert runic power into AoE damage. Not to mention that it is by far the best option whenever you are fighting more than one target, and this is true on almost all of the raid bosses and 100% true in 100% of the rest of the content the game can provide you with. Last row gives us Unholy Frenzy as the most versatile option available, especially in AoE. It aligns well with your other cooldowns and gives you decent burst windows. Army of the Damned tends to sim just a tad better in single target if you have 3 Magus of the Dead traits, which we will discuss in a bit, and if you have a buttload of haste on top of it as well. It might actually be a viable option in Horrific Visions due to the cooldown reduction it provides. The downside of it is that it either forces you to Death Coil in AoE scenarios where otherwise you would want to Epidemic, or forces you to Epidemic instead of Death Coiling, which wastes the efficiency and overall potential of the skill. Still, it could be an option down the road depending on how it scales and in Visions if it's worth playing with it. We didn't specify it too much at the moment, but for Horrific Visions you could go with the same build you take in Dungeon since the mob pattern is similar. The difference is where you actually have an issue, bosses or trash. That can answer the question on which build to take. An alternative is to click that goddamn bell thingy so you can get notified when you get infinite stars and echoing void corruption affixes, and sometimes our videos in your feed, but mostly the corruption affixes. As long as BFA is a thing, the best way to figure out what are the best stats for you will always be to sim yourself. You can go on websites like raidboss.com to achieve that, and it should be pretty straightforward from there. If you cannot be bothered to do it though, you can follow this general priority for raids and single target focused fights. Haste on top, followed by crits, and then versatility. Things get a bit tricky when we are talking 5 eye level differences between 2 items and a socket there as well, and it might not be easy to choose, but the difference would be minimal, and if you are set on min-maxing, then you shouldn't have a problem with simming. For dungeons and AoE especially, take Mastery on top of everything, followed by Haste and Crit once again. Mastery starts to scale better in AoE, and even more so when you get Blood of the Enemy that funnels crit like crazy into your face. So with this in mind, it should be fairly easy to get enchants and gems and such. You want to follow your stat priority above all else, if you don't plan on simming, of course. As a default, you can go with the Cord of Haste for your ring enchants and the Quicksand Spinel for your sockets. Your weapon will have Rune of the Fallen Crusader, of course, since it's cheap as in free, and strong as in the best in the game for melee because of the 15% strength buff. You also get healed when it procs, so that's always nice. The flask will be strength, no surprises here, while the potions can differ depending on what you aim for. Potion of Unbridled Fury is the go-to for one target fights, usually bosses. The standard superior strength is good for 2 to 3 targets, while the empowered proximity potion works on fights with 4 or more consistent targets. Lastly, Feast will be your ideal food buff of choice, or you can take baked potatoes for that haste buff. Keep in mind that you can replace all of these with their crit and mastery counterparts if ever you should choose to do so based on the content you do or what the sims will tell you. For gearing, the situation is actually quite simple for Unholy. It's the same as last patch, but the traits are fairly set in stone. You want to get Magus of the Dead 3 times. This makes your Apocalypse pop a Skelly Mage that shoots your target for crazy damage. The damage component stacks, so having 3 is ideal, especially for single target. The other 3 traits should be Fessure Mites. Bursting a wound gives you a chunk of strength, and the amount can stack from all 3, and the chunk is part of a Fessure Mite buff that also stacks on you up to 30 times. Yeah, a lot of strength. One thing to note here though is that the buff lasts for 20 seconds, and adding another stack up to 30 does not refresh it, so you will never get 20 seconds buff of 30 stacks of strength. The faster and the more wounds you pop at once, the more damage you get, and we will discuss this more in the rotation section. The other traits are fairly insignificant. You want mostly generic stat traits according to your stat priority. Also, another note is that if you don't have one of the 2 traits to stack 3 times, picking strong generic stat traits will probably be better overall. And another one, since the raid has these two on the same ring for a few pieces, excepting the ones from Carapace and Azoth, will be Bis most likely. You'll have to choose which one to get. Magus works better in single target and Feschermite in AoE, but I would recommend getting Magus anyway since the single target DPS bit is the weaker part of your kit, although still stronger than most other DPSers. Moving on to essences, things actually changed a bit from last patch, which is great in terms of playstyle. For raid, you want to go with Vision of Perfection Major. I know, right? Cray cray. This is if you have Magus of the Dead 3 times ideally, otherwise other essences might be better. Vision procs Apocalypse every now and again, and each time you get a Magus, so it works really well in single target. The minors will be Memory of Lucid Dreams and Meme Beam for the first 2 slots. They both help with speeding up your rotation through haste and rune regeneration. Last slot can be filled by Breath of the Dying for pure damage and the 10 corruption resistance if you need it. Or you can go with World Vein Resonance if you have a few other raid members using it. In dungeons, the major you want, and yes, it's shit, I know, Blood of the Enemy. It's the best one you can get since it aligns perfectly with all your cooldowns and essentially plays into your general approach to dungeons and packs since it matches with your Death and Decay window almost perfectly. If Blood of the Enemy is a pain to grind, and it is, you can replace it with Focusing Iris. It adds a burst of damage in AoE, which is something you need and can hold the spot until you get Blood of the Enemy because you have to get it eventually. As for minors, Memory of Lucid Dreams, again, Conflict and Strife is also very solid for the huge versatility buff. Purification Protocol is also amazing in terms of damage output, or you can always default to Breath of the Dying again for that 10 corruption resistance and very decent DPS output. The raid is actually decently generous to us as far as trinkets are concerned. The Vita Charged and the Void Twisted Titan Shards from Raden will be Bis for now, so yay? They are easy to get in the sense that they both drop from the same boss. The RNG gods will need some sacrifices, so they both drop for you and not just you loot the same one 4 times after looting neither for 3 weeks. Yeah, prepare your hopes. The trinkets proc with crit and haste respectively, which are both good stats, and when combined in the set, add a neat mechanic where you get a strength boost by collecting an orb that spawns. An alternative or placeholder is the Torment in a Jar from Zanesh. This is particularly good in AoE scenarios and drops fairly early in the raid as well. The best weapons to get, hands down, is still Getiku Cut of Skill from King's Rest. Yes, currently this is still better than all the raid weapons, mostly for the fact that their corruption effects are too costly for the difference in damage they provide. You have the Skjul Vaz axe that drops from Maut and has AoE damage if you cannot get Getiku, or the Devastation's Hour sword from N'Zoth that has one of the strongest corruption affixes in the game. Speaking of corruption, the reason you don't want the corrupted weapons is because their cost is too high and you can get those corruptions on other pieces and still have Getiku equipped since Getiku is already difficult enough to get. The best corruption affix to get at the moment is Echoing Void, which does very good in both single target and multi-target scenarios due to how the damage component works. Infinite Stars is a very close contender in pure single target scenarios, while Twilight Devastation, the one we mentioned from the weapon, works good in Mythic Plus and generally heavy ad fights. There are other corruptions you can go with, and it mostly falls down to how you can manage and mitigate the raw amount of corruption you have on yourself. It's difficult to say which to go for if you don't have the top contenders, but you can check bloodmallet.com where you can see the effects ranked and also by how efficient they are based on how much corruption they cost. Otherwise, just sim, I suppose. Ideally, you want to stay below 60 corruption to avoid the 4th debuff, which can prove lethal. With that being said, there are people who play with over 100 corruption, but that is very risky, providing you with dangerous situations, endangering yourself and most of all, your group, since your healers will struggle to keep you alive a lot. And if you cannot dodge the eye or mitigate it, dodge the thing from beyond or mitigate it or stun it, it will be pretty shit. It's actually quite challenging and a fun aspect of the game where, with enough practice, you can pull off way more damage than other people simply by mastering your class. When you open in single target, you want to cast Army of the Dead 2 seconds before the pool, quickly pre-pot and use Outbreak. Pop Dark Transformation and Unholy Frenzy and use your first Festering Strike. Death Coil next and follow it up with Apocalypse. Apocalypse should always be used with 4 wounds at least. The idea is that between your pet's auto attacks, your Unholy Frenzy auto attacks, and your Festering Strike, you would have 4 wounds already or closely to it by waiting 1 more melee swing. And it's way better this way because if you are also under Bloodlust, if you use 2 Festering Strikes in your Unholy Frenzy window, you will end up capping on wounds often, which they cap at 6 per target. When outside your cooldowns, you want to keep Virulent Plague up by using Outbreak, consume any Sudden Doom procs with Death Coil, or use it if you are above 80 runic power. Use Scourge Strike if you have more than 1 wound on the target, otherwise use Festering Strike, and fill in with Death Coil. The rotation is fairly simple outside cooldowns and not much to balance here in terms of management. The only thing to keep in mind is if the fight will require more damage from you during a specific phase, if that phase starts a few seconds later than when your cooldowns are available. If you don't have the fight planned out beforehand, which is a bit more advanced, then it's best to use all your major DPS buttons as soon as they become available instead of delaying them for that specific phase. Your AoE rotation boils down, similar to the single target, into 2 major rotations. Outside of your cooldowns, you keep Virulent Plague up, prevent runic power capping with Epidemic, cast Death and Decay, Scourge Strike while you are inside Death and Decay, Epidemic if you cannot do any of the above, Death Coil next to consume Sudden Doom procs, Scourge Strike to burst Festering Wounds on the target, and Festering Strikes otherwise with Death and Decoil as a filler. The idea here is that Epidemic will be used as the major runic power consumption on any 2 or more targets. The thing you need to keep in mind is that Unholy DK AoE rotation changes drastically once you have your cooldowns up, and you want to align all of them even if you need to delay one by 10 or so seconds. The rotation inside your major cooldowns will change based on how long the pack will survive, how many targets you have, and all of this is something you have to decide. First, you want to start with Outbreak as usual. If the pack is smaller, you can apply 2 Festering Strikes to each of the 2 or 3 mobs you're fighting. If the pack is large enough, you might only have time to apply 1 Festering Strike to about 3 or 4 maybe mobs in total, different mobs that is. Pop then Dark Transformation, pop Unholy Frenzy, put down Death and Decay and spam Scourge Strikes to burst 1 wound on each mob with each cast, and Epidemic to prevent capping on runic power. Soul Reaper and Epidemic spams will regenerate runes as you do this. As far as Runic Corruption is concerned, it takes a few seconds to get its full effect, so if you find yourself needing to spend a lot of runic power, try to do it closer to the start of your Death and Decay window than the last bit, since there is no benefit in coming outside those 10 seconds of Death and Decay with all runes regenerated. There's a lot more to discuss here, details and in-depth tips that we cannot add to the video. The rotation has been theory crafted and tested by Bicep Pumps in the Acris Discord. You can and should go there for more details and also check other resources like Pump's Wowhead Guide. And speaking of Pumps, a big shout out to the man himself and so for helping us feedback and fact check and make sure that the guide is ready and very accurate for you guys, even if it's on the beginner side. With that being said, if you want to experience Unholy and learn about more that Unholy can provide, like mentioned, try to check their online resources. Pumps is writing the Wowhead Guide, and they have a lot of information down in the Acris Discord channel. So thank you guys, and thank you Acris for all of the Death Knight information you provided us with. And thank you very much to our patrons for their ongoing support month after month, ensuring that we constantly improve the quality of our work and the videos that we put out for you. And if you are interested in showing a little bit more support, then you can check the links down below. We have a Patreon link and some merch there as well. Thank you for watching the video, and see you next time.
Never thought I'd meet someone